Forget the myth's real Viking passion was raw, wild, and often shocking. From shocking rituals to rules that would leave us stunned today, Viking intimacy was anything but ordinary. These fearless Norse warriors lived by bold traditions and surprising codes of desire that defied modern expectations. Today, we're uncovering the untold secrets of Viking love and lust. Get ready once you hear this, you'll never look at the Vikings the same way again. The cold wind pressed against the walls of the timber longhouse, sighing through the smoke hole as if it carried the voices of the fjord itself. Within, the hearth burned low, its glow painting the beams with amber light. Men, women, children, thralls all shared the same breath of warmth. Wool cloaks wrapped around shoulders, thick furs pulled over bodies, and the crackle of fire became the lullaby of the night. Here, in this simple chamber of life and survival, one could glimpse what Vikings considered normal in sex, not whispered behind closed doors. For there were no walls to hide behind, but lived openly, measured by the gaze of kin, neighbour, and clan. In the Viking world, intimacy was not secluded. It unfolded in the hush of communal living, in the dim glow of hearthlight, where bodies lay close enough to hear each other's sighs. A Viking man stretched upon the sleeping bench, his breath mingling with that of his kin, while across the hall a Viking woman hushed her infant with soft strokes, the child's wail dissolving into the rhythm of fire and voices. A Viking child curled at his mother's side, dreaming of hunts and summer meadows, while the air grew heavy with the scent of sweat, smoke, and salted Viking food still clinging to the rafters. There was no thought of privacy as we know it. Privacy was a silence of courtesy, an averted glance, a tactful turning of the head while the life of the household carried on. The timber walls bore witness to all. Laughter, quarrels, the quiet joining of lovers beneath a cloak, and the cries of newborns delivered in darkness. To live as a Viking was to live under watchful eyes. Each action, each gesture, each murmur carried meaning. When a man touched his wife's arm, when a woman returned the glance of her betrothed, it was never entirely secret. It was folded into the rhythm of the household, the communal breath of survival. A Viking man's honour depended on how he guarded the chastity of his household, while a Viking woman's standing rested on her modesty, her fidelity, her quiet strength. And yet, within this closeness, there was tenderness. The brushing of hands as wood was passed to the fire, the whispered joke that drew a shy smile in the dimness, the way a couple shifted their cloaks, creating a shadowed pocket of intimacy amidst the press of bodies. In such moments, passion was not wild or wanton, but woven into the fabric of necessity, quiet, fleeting, yet strong enough to ripple through kin and clan. Beyond the longhouse, the fjord howled, ice cracking on its edge. Inside, the world was smaller, heavier, and bound by duty. A Viking man did not seek passion alone, but the continuation of his line. A Viking woman did not surrender herself for love, but for the honour of her family, the strength of her children, the survival of her kin. This was their truth. Not hidden, not whispered, but lived in the open flame of the hearth, where all could see, where all could remember, and where silence itself became the only curtain between the sacred and the ordinary. The longhouse lay heavy with night, the roof beams sagging beneath centuries of smoke, its air thick with the mingled scents of ash, wool, and boiled fish. The hearth still glowed in the centre, embers pulsing like the heart of the household, while families lay pressed together along the wooden benches that lined the walls. There were no partitions here, no curtains to shield one soul from another. A Viking man could feel the warmth of his brother's breath only an arm's length away, while beyond him a Viking child stirred in dreams, clutching a carved wooden toy to his chest. In such closeness, the rules of the longhouse were not carved in runes, but lived in silence, in subtle gestures, in the invisible web of respect that held the household together. When the fire dimmed, voices softened, A Viking woman might whisper to her husband beneath the firs, her words meant for his ears alone, though half the household could hear the cadence. Yet no one remarked. To comment was to break the balance, to stir the embers of shame that burned hotter than flame. Privacy was not space but courtesy, the turning of a head, the sudden busying of hands with wool or wood. A Viking child quickly learned when to look away, when to let curiosity become feigned sleep. These were the unspoken lessons of survival, just as vital as learning to row a ship or harvest grain. In the deep hours, the sounds of the longhouse became their own language, the cough of an elder, the shifting weight of a dog, the faint rustle of bodies beneath cloaks. Lovers knew how to move quietly, how to time their closeness with the crack of wood on the fire or the howl of wind against the door. To overstep, to let passions spill too openly into the shared air, was a breach. Not because desire was forbidden, but because harmony was sacred. The household was a vessel, and any crack in its walls could let the storm in. Yet, even in such restraint, there was warmth. A Viking man reaching to tuck the fur closer around his wife's shoulders, a Viking woman smoothing the hair of her child as he slept, the old grandmother murmuring charms into the dark to guard the newborns. These acts were not hidden, they were lived before all eyes, and in being lived, they bound the house together tighter than any nail or beam. The smell of Viking food still lingered from the evening meal, salted meat, barley bread, dried fish smoked over pine. It clung to cloaks, to hair, to the very rafters. Hunger and satisfaction alike were shared, just as intimacy and laughter were shared. The longhouse rules were born of necessity. Where dozens slept as one, boundaries had to be made, not with walls, but with silence, with understanding, with the quiet pact that what was seen would not always be spoken. So the longhouse endured its order, kept not by laws written on stone, but by the discipline of courtesy. Every Viking man, every Viking woman, every Viking child grew within these rules. They were as natural as the tides, as constant as the frost. And under those heavy rafters, amidst smoke and sighs, life unfolded in plain sight, yet remained whole, unbroken, and sacred. The longhouse breathed like a living creature, every whisper and gesture echoing louder than the crack of an oar against water. In the Viking world, reputation stood like shieldwood, broad, strong, and unyielding, yet ever at risk of splintering under one well-aimed blow. A Viking man's worth was measured not only by the sharpness of his sword or the weight of his silver, but by the stories others told of him when the fire burned low. A Viking woman, too, carried her family's honour in her every step, her modesty and loyalty scrutinized as carefully as a warrior's blade. One rumour, carried on the wind of a careless tongue, could cut deeper than steel, and its scar could linger for generations. By the hearth, where Viking food simmered in iron pots, elders reminded the young of the unseen battles that decided a life's course. Guard your words, they would say, for words strike harder than axes. A Viking child, wide-eyed in the glow of embers, listened and learned that a name once stained was seldom cleansed. For in a world without parchment law, reputation was law itself, and every man and woman lived beneath its judgment. A Viking man who failed to protect his kin's honour was marked as weak, no matter his victories in battle. If his wife was accused of straying, or if his daughter's virtue was questioned, shame spread through his household like smoke. Neighbours remembered, rivals whispered, and the story was retold at every gathering until it hardened into truth. A Viking woman's place was just as fragile. Fidelity, modesty, and quiet strength defined her standing, yet envy or malice could undo her in a single evening's gossip. A simple glance too long at another man, a word misheard at the well, could unravel her dignity and with it her family's standing. Even jest carried weight. The sagas speak of insults hurled in verse, mocking a man's manhood or a woman's chastity. Such barbs were not dismissed as idle humour. They were sparks on dry timber. A Viking man so insulted might demand satisfaction with steel, for to let the words stand was to invite ruin. And if he faltered, if he showed hesitation, the stain of cowardice clung forever. To be branded unmanly, to be called soft in a land where frost itself bit like iron, was to lose not just respect, but the right to stand among equals. But reputation was not only burden, it was treasure. A Viking woman of untarnished name could sway alliances with her presence alone, her counsel sought at feasts, her kin honoured through her conduct. A Viking child born of a household respected by all inherited a legacy more valuable than gold. Farmers traded more willingly, warriors answered the call to arms more swiftly, and suitors came bearing richer gifts. Reputation was shieldwood indeed, protecting families from hunger, from enemies, from isolation. Thus, life was lived in constant vigilance. Every word spoken, every glance exchanged, every step taken was weighed against the judgment of others. Not because Vikings feared shadow, but because they knew survival was bound to honour. To lose it was to be left adrift, without shield, without kin, without name. And so they guarded it fiercely, like flame against the night, for in a world where death came swiftly, and the earth remembered little, reputation endured longer than flesh, stronger than steel, and heavier than stone. At first light, when the mist still clung to the fjord, and the cries of gulls echoed over the water, the people gathered in the clearing. The earth was damp, the grass jewelled with dew, and the air sharp with the scent of pine and salt. Here, under the open sky, the Viking law was spoken, not from books or scrolls, but from memory, oath, and honour. There were no prisons, no walls to contain a man, only his name, his word, and the judgment of the community that bound him tighter than iron. A Viking man stood among his peers, cloak pulled tight against the morning chill, waiting to hear whether a rumour, a poem, or a promise would lift his standing or strike it down. The circle formed slowly. Elders with weathered faces leaned on their staffs, their voices carrying the weight of long memory. Younger warriors lingered at the edge, eager to learn the ways of justice, but careful not to speak too quickly. A Viking woman might stand beside her kin, her presence silent yet powerful, for her word could sway the tide if her reputation held strong. Even a Viking child, clinging to his mother's skirts, absorbed the lesson that law was not distant. It lived in every whisper carried to this place. The accusations came as stories, sometimes sharp, sometimes tangled. One man accused another of composing a mocking verse that questioned his manhood. Another brought forth witnesses who claimed a woman had been courted with secret gifts. Such matters were not dismissed as trifles, for in the Viking world, words could wound deeper than weapons. A single insult, a careless poem, might fracture bonds between families, ignite feuds, and leave blood upon the soil. The assembly's task was not punishment alone, but balance, to steady the scale before it tipped into chaos. The people listened, their silence heavy as stone. Then, one by one, voices rose. A Viking man defended his honour with oaths, swearing by the gods, by his kin, by the earth itself. A rival countered with witnesses, men who swore they had heard the offending verse recited at a feast. The assembly weighed each word, each gesture, each glance. In this open-air court, truth was not hidden in parchment. It was shaped by memory, reputation, and the courage to stand beneath the sky. Judgments were declared with solemn gravity. Fines in silver or livestock, exile for those who could not be trusted, and in rare cases, the freedom to strike down an offender without fear of vengeance. The sentence was carried not by guards, but by the very eyes of the community. To be shamed here was to be cut adrift, to lose the shield of kinship, to walk the world marked as broken. And yet, this law was not only a blade, it was also a thread that bound. Promises made at the assembly were sealed with handshakes and witnessed by all. Marriages were confirmed, Feuds ended with gifts, and disputes over land resolved before they became storms. The people dispersed at last, the morning sun now warm on their faces, knowing that law had been kept beneath the open sky. For in the Viking Age, justice was not a place of stone and iron. It was a living pact, spoken in the breath of neighbours, held in memory, and guarded by the strength of community itself. Snow pressed against the roof of the longhouse, the weight of winter groaning in the beams, while inside the hall glowed warm with fire and voices. Men and women gathered around the hearth, steam rising from pots of stewed meat and bread thick with barley. The air was rich with the smell of Viking food, mingled with the tang of pine smoke and the sharp bite of mead. Tonight was no ordinary feast. Tonight, two families prepared to weave their bloodlines together, for marriage among the Norse was not a matter of hearts. Alone, it was a bridge, built of silver, land, and honour, stretched across generations yet unborn. At the head of the hall, a Viking man rose, cloak trimmed with fur, his voice carrying above the murmur. He spoke of the bride price, the pledge of worth given by the groom's kin. This was not payment for a woman, but a vow that she would be honoured, clothed, and fed. A Viking woman across the fire nodded, her hand resting on the key ring at her belt, symbol of the authority she would one day pass to the bride. Keys to chests, to storerooms, to the very lifeblood of the household. This was the true crown of a Viking wife. The families leaned forward, their faces lit by flame. The dowry was named next, the wealth the bride's kin would send with her, woven cloth, livestock, and perhaps a carved chest filled with heirlooms. These treasures were not trifles, but anchors, ensuring that even in hardship she would have standing, and her children would have claim to their place. The dowry spoke of her father's honour, just as the bride price declared the groom's. Between them, a bridge of silver and memory was built, strong enough to carry the weight of futures yet unseen. As the mead horn passed, the hall softened with laughter and song. A Viking child slipped between the benches, stealing a roasted morsel, while his elders chuckled and pulled him into their arms. The feast was more than food, it was the binding of spirits. Each guest, each witness, became a thread in the tapestry of the marriage. Their eyes saw, their ears heard, their voices remembered. In this way, the union was more than two. It was the knitting of clans, of fields, of fortunes. Later, when the night deepened and the torches burned low, the bride's family brought forth her gifts. A spindle and distaff, a chest of cloth, perhaps even a small icon of the gods. The groom's kin laid before her gifts of their own, a sword to symbolize protection, a cloak for warmth, and the solemn promise that she would stand not as servant, but as lady of the household. In the hush of the longhouse, her father placed the key ring into her hand. The weight of it was both heavy and proud, a sign that she now carried the strength of her lineage into a new hearth. Thus, marriage was sealed not in whispers of love, though affection might grow, but in the calm cadence of duty. To the Viking people, such unions were as vital as walls against the storm. They were bridges of honour and necessity, joining not just man and woman, but the survival of kin, the strength of farms, and the promise that life would endure through the endless winters to come. The hall was hushed, though fire crackled bright in the central hearth, throwing long shadows against the timber walls. Men and women leaned close, their cloaks smelling of pine smoke and salted hides, as a ritual older than memory prepared to unfold. This was no battle, no raid upon distant shores, but a ceremony of power, quiet, steady, and heavy with meaning. For in the Viking world, two objects spoke louder than words, the sword and the keys. One bound the bloodline, the other guarded the hearth. Together, they told the story of what it meant to live and endure. At the high seat, a Viking man rose. His beard caught the firelight, and in his hands lay the sword of his fathers. Its edge was worn from years of use, notched from battle, yet polished with care until it gleamed like frost under moonlight. He placed it before the young groom, his son, his nephew, or his sworn heir, and with solemn voice declared that this blade carried not just iron, but lineage. It was a promise that blood would flow into the next generation, that the line would not fade with winter's chill. Every Viking child, sitting wide-eyed along the benches, knew this gesture by heart. They had seen it before, and they would see it again, for it was the rhythm of their people's life, the handing forward of strength. Across the fire, the bride's kin stepped forth. A Viking woman, her shoulders wrapped in a cloak trimmed with fox, held a ring of keys that jingled softly with every step. These were no simple tools, but the guardians of the household, keys to storerooms of barley, to chests of wool, to cupboards where salt and silver slept. She placed them in the bride's hand, her fingers lingering a moment as if to pass on not just iron, but knowledge, how to stretch food through a harsh winter, how to guard honour against gossip, how to keep a household strong while men sailed far from home. For the Viking wife did not wield sword and shield, but her power was no less vital. Every lock she opened, every chest she guarded, was a fortress of survival. The hall murmured approval. The guests lifted their cups of mead, and the smell of Viking food filled the air: smoked lamb, roasted fish, thick loaves of rye bread. Dogs barked beneath the tables, catching scraps, while children craned their necks to watch the sacred exchange. They whispered among themselves, but not too loudly, for they knew they were witnessing something weighty. A Viking child might not yet understand the weight of honour, but he would remember the sword passed like fire between men. A Viking girl might not yet command her own household, but she would recall the sound of keys as they were given, and in that moment she learned what awaited her. When the sword and keys had been exchanged, silence held the longhouse for a heartbeat. Then came the songs, the laughter, the toasts. Yet beneath the clamour, the memory of that moment lingered, solemn and unbroken. For in the Viking age, love was not sealed with kisses alone, but with iron and duty. The sword promised the bloodline. The keys promised survival. And every Viking man, every Viking woman, every Viking child grew up beneath the weight of those symbols, knowing that without them, no household, no family, no kin could endure the endless winters or the restless sea. The longhouse pulsed with life, though outside the snow lay deep, pressing against the walls like a frozen sea. Smoke curled from the central hearth, carrying the scent of pine wood and roasted meat, while the rafters above glistened with drying fish and strips of venison. In this place, where survival balanced on the edge of every season, the unseen strength of the household did not rest only in the warrior's arm or the Viking man's sword. It rested in the quiet authority of the woman who bore the keys. A Viking woman's belt jingled softly as she walked, the iron keys hanging like runes of power. Each key unlocked a chest, a storeroom, or a cupboard of treasures more vital than silver grain for bread, wool for weaving, honey for mead, salt for keeping the meat through winter. These keys were not ornaments. They were symbols of trust, responsibility, and rule. While men sailed to distant shores, seeking plunder or trade, it was the women of the keys who safeguarded the hearth, the farm, and the lineage. By the fire, a Viking child warmed his hands, watching his mother measure out barley for the evening meal. Her movements were deliberate, careful, as though each scoop carried the weight of the family's survival. She knew how much could be eaten tonight, how much must be saved for the lean weeks before spring. Too much indulgence, and the family would starve before the thaw. Too little, and spirits would wither in the darkness. A Viking woman learned this balance as surely as a warrior learned to balance shield and axe. The sound of weaving filled the hall, the steady clack of loom weights echoing like the rhythm of the sea. Wool spun into cloth was as precious as any hoard, for it clothed the household, warmed the children, and sometimes even served as currency. A Viking man might boast of silver arm rings and victories across the water, but it was the cloth his wife produced that wrapped him through frost and storm. Viking food, Viking garments, Viking hearth, all passed through the hands of the woman with the keys. She knew the secrets of herbs, how to soothe fevers, how to heal wounds, how to ease a child's restless sleep. She knew the ways of storing milk as cheese, of drying fish on the wind, of smoking meat until it could last for months. Each task was small, quiet, and easily overlooked. Yet without them, the longhouse would collapse into hunger and despair. Her strength was not sung in skaldic verse, yet every Viking child who lived through winter knew it was her steadiness that carried them. When guests arrived, it was she who welcomed them, her hands offering bread and ale, her judgment deciding how much of the stores could be spared. Hospitality was law, but it was also strategy, for generosity could forge alliances as strong as steel. A Viking woman, who managed her keys wisely, brought honour not only to herself, but to her entire kin. Thus the hall endured, season after season, storm after storm. The sword might defend the threshold, but it was the keys that kept the fire burning, the bellies filled, and the family whole. In the hush of winter nights, when the wind howled like wolves beyond the walls, it was not the Viking man's spear, but the Viking woman's wisdom that ensured the longhouse would greet the dawn. The morning mist clung low to the earth, silvering the meadows and softening the outlines of the hills. Beyond the fjord, gulls cried over the dark water, and the sound of axes echoed faintly from the tree line. Inside the longhouse, where the smoke of last night's fire still drifted, a Viking man stirred from his bench, rising with the weight of duty heavy on his shoulders. His was not always the life of blood and raiding that the skalds sang by firelight. More often, it was the life of quiet vigilance, guarding honour, tending kin, and walking the narrow path where restraint mattered as much as strength. He stepped out into the cold dawn, his cloak drawn tight, and breathed in the sharp scent of frost and earth. Around him, other Viking men moved steadily, their hands not on sword hilts but on ploughs, on fishing nets, on the reins of oxen. For though the sagas sang of war, the fields demanded their own kind of courage. To coax life from the stubborn soil, to endure seasons of hunger, to guard the household's dignity when whispers spread faster than fire, these tasks shaped a man's worth as surely as steel. By the hearth, a Viking child watched his father sharpen a scythe, the rasp of stone on iron ringing like a promise. The boy's eyes were wide, not because the tool was a weapon, but because in its edge lay the promise of bread, of barley ground into meal, of Viking food steaming in clay pots through winter nights. He learned that honour was not only defended in battle, but in the quiet persistence of providing, in the discipline of a man who kept watch even when no eyes were upon him. At feasts, where laughter thundered and horns overflowed with mead, restraint was a warrior's unseen shield. A Viking man knew that one careless boast, one insult left unanswered, could undo him more swiftly than a spear thrust. He measured his words as carefully as he measured his blows, for the household standing balanced on his temper. To rise in fury too quickly marked him as reckless, to remain silent when shamed branded him weak. Between these edges he walked, a figure of calm strength, his silence often more formidable than his voice. When the longhouse grew restless with gossip, when a neighbour's tongue wagged too freely, it was often the steady hand of such men that kept feuds from sparking into flame. They did not rush to violence, though they knew how to wield it. Instead, they weighed honour as one weighs silver, considering its true worth before spending it. Their patience was not cowardice, it was mastery. And yet, when danger shadowed the doorway, the same Viking man who bent patiently over furrows, or guarded his kin's reputation with calm words, would lift axe and shield without hesitation. His strength was not diminished by his restraint. It was deepened by it, like a river whose surface flows gentle, while its undercurrent pulls fierce and strong. In this balance lay the heart of manhood in the north. The Viking man was farmer, judge, protector, and warrior all in one. His honour was shieldwood, his restraint its polish, his strength its iron core. And every Viking child who grew beneath his gaze knew that true power did not always shout. It often stood in silence, steady as stone, unyielding as the fjord itself. The longhouse glowed with firelight, its beams darkened by centuries of smoke. Around the central hearth, families gathered close, the air rich with the scent of Viking food, stewed lamb, barley bread, and smoked fish hanging from the rafters. Children pressed near their mothers, elders leaned on their staffs, and Viking men spoke low among themselves, voices steady yet measured. For here, in the flicker of warmth against the long winter night, words carried more weight than iron. A careless tongue could spark a feud, fiercer than any storm at sea. A Viking man knew that steel could wound the body, but words could unmake the soul. To call a warrior unmanly, to hint that he had taken a passive role in bed, was to strike at the heart of his honour. Such an insult was not mere jest. It was a wound deeper than any axe blow, a blow that could strip him of his place among his kin. By the fire, where tales were told, and laughter sometimes sharpened into mockery, restraint became a weapon as vital as a sword. Each Viking child, listening wide-eyed to the murmur of adults, learned quickly which words were forbidden to speak and why silence was often safer than boldness. Insults about a woman's chastity, too, were heavier than stone. To whisper that a Viking woman had strayed was to stain her entire household, to threaten her children's inheritance, and to dishonour her husband before the community. Such words could not be unsaid. They clung like smoke in the rafters, spreading from ear to ear until the whole village breathed them. The accused might defend herself, her kin might rise in her stead, but the damage, once loosed, was hard to contain. Thus, gossip was not idle, it was a fire, and all knew how quickly fire devoured timber. Because of this, language was guarded as carefully as weapons. A Viking man weighed his words at the feast, knowing that one verse spoken in jest might cost him blood by morning. Skalds, masters of poetry, walked this line most dangerously. Their sagas and verses brought fame, but one mocking stanza, aimed too sharply, could unleash bloodshed. A Viking woman, too, chose her words with precision, for her counsel could calm or provoke, guide or destroy. Speech was a form of power, and all who held it were bound by its danger. Yet in this world of perilous language, words also healed. Oaths sworn before witnesses bound peace between rivals. Promises made beneath the open sky stitched feuds into alliances. A Viking child heard these moments and remembered that the tongue which could cut like steel could also bind like sinew. The same fire that consumed could warm and preserve. So the longhouse endured its winters, not only by the strength of axes or the stores of Viking food, but by the discipline of speech. For in the north, where life was harsh and kinship fragile, the village peace rested not on walls or prisons, but on the unseen guard of careful words spoken beneath the firelight. The night lay heavy upon the fjord, its black waters shimmering with the silver of moonlight. Inside the timbered longhouse, the fire burned low, throwing amber light across fur-cloaked benches and the carved beams above. Families sat close, bellies warm with Viking food, barley bread, smoked fish, and thick stew ladled into wooden bowls. Laughter rose now and then, but softer tones wove beneath it, tones reserved for matters as delicate as weaving linen. The stirrings of courtship, spoken in low voices, careful beneath the watchful eyes of kin. A Viking man sat across from the woman he hoped to wed, his gaze steady but respectful, his words measured. To speak too boldly risked dishonour, yet to remain silent forever was to lose his chance. So he strung his phrases like beads, offering small compliments, remarks on her skill at weaving, on the grace of her movements, on the way her kin kept their house well. He spoke not of desire, but of steadiness, of honour, of the strength he could bring to her father's farm. For in this world, love did not roar like fire, but it flickered gently, like embers, coaxed to life with patience. The Viking woman listened, her face calm, though her eyes sparkled in the dim light. She answered carefully, not in declarations, but in hints praise for his skill with axe and plough, for the fairness with which he treated his kin. Her words, soft and deliberate, carried more weight than 100 reckless promises. Around them, the hall stirred. A Viking child tugged at his mother's skirts, begging for another piece of meat, while elders exchanged glances, pretending not to hear yet listening all the same. Nothing in the longhouse escaped notice. Love, if it was to grow, had to root itself within this web of shared life. At times, songs filled the air gentler verses than those of battle or sea. Skalds knew how to lace their poems with meaning, praising beauty or weaving metaphors of spring's renewal. A Viking man might request such a verse, his eyes never leaving the woman across the fire. If she blushed but did not turn away, it was answer enough. If she laughed too lightly or spoke too sharply, he knew his cause was weakened. In these small exchanges, futures were decided, clans joined or divided. When the night deepened and the torches guttered low, glances became as eloquent as words. A Viking woman, adjusting her cloak to shield a suitor from the cold draught. A Viking man rising to refill her cup before his own. These gestures, small and fleeting, carried messages as clear as oaths. Kin noticed them, weighing them, deciding whether they honoured the family or risked its standing. Courtship was not rebellion, it was negotiation, woven gently into custom so that love might bloom without tearing the fabric of duty. And so, in the hush of the longhouse, where smoke curled into the rafters and the wind howled beyond the door, love was spoken in low voices. It was not shouted nor hidden, but carried carefully, like fire cupped in two hands. Every Viking man, every Viking woman, every Viking child knew that affection had its place in the hall, soft, steady, and bound by the laws of kin and custom. The hearth glowed deep with coals, their heat pressing against the skins and cloaks hung to dry along the walls. Shadows flickered on carved posts where dragons and serpents curled in silent watch. The smell of Viking food lingered in the air, smoked mutton, turnips roasted in embers, and the faint sweetness of honeyed ale. Around the fire sat kin and guests, their faces ruddy with warmth, their voices low. It was in such gatherings that words were loosed like arrows, though no steel was drawn. For a skald's verse could bless a household or ruin it. A Viking man leaned forward, his elbow on his knee, as the poet began. The hall grew hushed, the only sound, the crackle of flame and the jingling of a dog's collar as it shifted near the benches. The skald's voice rose steady, each syllable sharpened as if cut on whetstone. He spoke of honour, of battles won and voyages endured, weaving the names of the family into bright threads of glory. The listeners nodded, their pride swelling, for to hear one's kin praised in verse was to be remembered long after bone had turned to dust. But every Viking child also knew the danger that lived within a poem. A misplaced word, a sly suggestion hidden in rhyme, could wound deeper than any blade. To hint that a Viking man was cowardly, or that a Viking woman's virtue was questioned, was not simply jest. It was accusation, heavy as iron, carried in rhythm so that it echoed and could not be forgotten. Once spoken, such words lived on the tongues of others, repeated by travellers, remembered at assemblies, carried across fjords like whispers of shame. Thus the skald walked a narrow path, his gift both revered and feared. He must know when to praise with fire, when to tease with gentleness, and when to guard his tongue like a shield. He measured names carefully, for names held power. To carve a name in verse was to place it in the tapestry of memory, to bind it to glory or disgrace. A Viking woman who heard her name sung in admiration might smile behind her hand, but she also knew the weight of eyes upon her. A Viking man who heard his name tied to ridicule might feel his blood rise, for the law gave him the right to answer such insult with steel. The hall stirred as the poem ended, mead horns raised in approval. Yet, beneath the laughter, each guest carried the memory of the words spoken, the names preserved. Later, in the quiet of their own homes, they would repeat them by firelight, teaching children to remember. And so the verses spread, alive long after the voice of the skald fell silent. In this way, poetry was more than art. It was law, judgment, and legacy. By the hearth, among the smell of Viking food and the warmth of kin, a verse could lift a family into honour or cast it into shadow. Words, once woven into rhythm, were not easily undone. They were weapons and gifts alike, and every Viking man, woman, and child knew their power. Snow pressed hard against the roof of the longhouse, muting the sound of the storm that howled beyond the fjord. Inside, the fire glowed low, filling the hall with the smell of pine resin and boiling broth. Viking food simmered in clay pots, barley thickened with dried herbs, a little mutton for strength, and its scent mingled with the sharp tang of smoke. On this night, the house was not filled with feasting or the clash of dice, but with a deeper, quieter anticipation. A woman laboured in the corner, and the breath of every Viking man, Viking woman, and Viking child seemed to wait with her. The midwife's hands were steady, weathered from years of bringing life into the world. She moved with calm purpose, heating water in bronze cauldrons, laying out clean wool, whispering charms as old as the hills. Around her neck hung amulets, Thor's hammer, smooth stones worn by river currents, bits of bone carved with runes, all believed to guard mother and child. Her lips murmured blessings with each contraction, soft as lullabies yet heavy with power. In the Viking world, childbirth was no simple act. It was a battle of its own, fought not with axe and shield, but with endurance, faith, and the courage of women. A Viking man paced the hearth, restless hands tugging at his beard. He could not enter the birthing space, yet his honour was tied to its outcome. If the child lived, his lineage was strengthened. If the woman died, whispers would follow. Was it bad luck? Was it the gods? Or was it some shame left unspoken? He stoked the fire, ladled broth, and tried to steady his heart, though his ears strained for the sound of the infant's first cry. The other women of the household worked silently, their movements swift but reverent. One laid fresh straw on the floor. Another placed bread and salted fish on a wooden dish, a simple offering for the spirits that watched unseen. A Viking child peeked from behind a bench, wide-eyed, watching the seriousness that cloaked the faces of the adults. For the child, this was a mystery, the struggle of breath and blood, the whispered runes, the low moans of his mother or aunt. He would not understand until he grew, but he would remember the gravity of this night. As the storm clawed at the walls, the midwife lifted her voice in prayer, calling upon the gods to lend strength. The woman cried out, sweat running down her temples despite the cold. Then, at last, a sound broke through the longhouse, louder than the gale outside, the wail of a newborn. Relief flooded the room like warm mead. The midwife wrapped the infant in wool and held it aloft, showing it first to the fire, as was custom, so that flame and life might recognize one another. A cheer rose, muffled yet fierce, from the gathered kin. The Viking man sagged with relief, his shoulders heavy no more. The Viking woman who had laboured now rested, pale but alive, as a horn of ale was pressed to her lips. The infant, still squirming, was laid upon the family bed, a place of honour, and a name would soon be spoken to bind it to kin and story. In that moment, the household was renewed. Storms might rage, enemies might threaten, but within the longhouse a fragile flame had been kindled. And every Viking child who grew up in that hall would remember that winter births, though quiet and unseen, carried the same weight as victories on distant shores. Life, blessed by amulet, warmed by fire, guarded by courage, was the truest triumph of all. Frost clung white upon the beams of the longhouse, dripping slowly as the fire's heat stirred it into rivulets that trickled down the carved posts. The hall smelled of wool cloaks drying by the hearth, of Viking food simmering in clay pots, barley thickened with goat's milk, venison seasoned with herbs, and flatbread toasted upon stones. Yet beneath the warmth of meal and mead, a more solemn matter held the household's attention: the thread of legitimacy, the cord that bound lineage, property, and honour into a single weave. When a child was born, the first cry was not enough. Breath marked life, but recognition marked belonging. A Viking man stood before kin and neighbours, lifting the infant onto the family bed, the place where union had been made and witnessed. This act was no small gesture. It was the seal that the child was his, that the blood flowing in its veins would carry the farmstead into future winters. Without that moment, doubts might creep like frost into the cracks of stone, and a lineage could fracture. The naming followed soon after. Names were never chosen lightly. To call a Viking child by the name of a grandfather was to summon his spirit, to anchor the newborn to memory and expectation. A boy might be named for a warrior who fell with sword in hand, so that his life would echo that courage. A girl might be named for a wise woman, keeper of keys and fields, her name a blessing for household strength. In these names lay inheritance not only of property, but of story, and stories were the marrow of the North. Around the hearth, whispers weighed heavily. If a Viking man hesitated to place the child on the bed, suspicion spread like smoke. Was the babe his? Was its blood pure? Such doubts were poison. They threatened not only the child, but the family's standing among kin and neighbours. Farms, alliances, and futures balanced upon legitimacy. For without it, claims could be challenged, land divided, and feuds born that might outlast generations. Even Viking food upon the table bore silent witness to these truths. The bread was broken and shared not only for nourishment, but as a sign of union grain from the fields of the family, meat hunted by its men, milk drawn from its beasts. To eat together was to affirm belonging, and every mouthful taken by the new mother and her child was part of this unspoken oath. Yet beneath these solemn customs lay tenderness. A Viking woman cradled her newborn, humming softly, while the firelight painted the child's face in gold. A Viking man bent near, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as they touched the small brow. Though honour and law demanded the rituals, love often bound them tighter. And still, kin and community watched closely, ensuring that no thread was loose, no claim uncertain. Thus, the thread of legitimacy was spun, woven from bed, name, witness, and acknowledgement. It was more fragile than iron, yet stronger than stone, for it ensured that farms endured, that Viking children inherited not only land but honour, and that the voices of ancestors carried forward in the names of the living. The fire burned low in the longhouse, its embers glowing like the eyes of old gods beneath the rafters. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of pine smoke, wool cloaks drying from the snow, and Viking food flatbread, salted herring, and goat stew thickened with barley. Around the hearth, kin sat close, their voices hushed, for in this hall the rhythm of life was not only measured by the clash of swords, but by the subtler order of the household. And within that order lay a truth often unspoken: concubines, and the calm they were expected to keep beneath the roof of a Viking family. A Viking man of means might bring home more than one woman. The wife held the key's heavy iron that clinked at her belt, symbols of her authority over stores, livestock, and the weaving of cloth. But alongside her, a concubine might live, not in defiance of custom, but within it. She was neither servant nor equal, bound in a place between. Her hands kneaded bread, spun flax, rocked cradles, yet her presence also stirred the delicate balance of honour and inheritance. The wife was the stone at the hearth's heart, expected to keep silence from turning to storm. A Viking woman of stature would not allow jealousy to spill into the open. Her steadiness preserved her dignity and her household's name. At times, she wielded quiet power, ensuring the concubine knew her station, guiding her duties, even protecting her when it served the household's peace. For harmony was not weakness, it was strength, the invisible cord that bound families tighter than rope. A Viking child, watching from a bench, might not see strife at all. To him, the concubine was simply another figure tending the fire, another voice singing soft lullabies when the winter wind screamed through the shutters. He would not yet know of the whispers that trailed behind such unions, nor of the subtle glances exchanged between kin. To the child, the longhouse remained whole, its warmth intact, its food shared without visible fracture. The concubine herself bore a weight both quiet and perilous. If favoured, her children might be acknowledged, their lives steadier than the snowbound poor beyond the walls. If not, they could live in shadow, known but not fully claimed. Still, her place endured because Viking men, in their pursuit of labour, lineage, and strength, found her presence useful. The sagas tell of wives who demanded a choice, of concubines who rose in fortune, of others who vanished into silence. Yet in most homes, peace was preserved, not by thunderous quarrels, but by restraint. At feasts, where mead horns clashed and laughter rang, the lines remained clear. The wife presided with quiet dignity, while the concubine kept her gaze lowered, her voice soft. To upset this order was to invite gossip, and gossip was a fire far more dangerous than any candle's flame. Thus, calm was not an accident, it was a craft, woven daily by those who knew that households survived, not only on strength of arm, but on steadiness of heart. So it was that concubines became part of the weave of Viking life. Neither hidden nor exalted, they lived in the shadow of keys and swords, in the warmth of shared fires, in the unspoken agreements that kept a family whole. For in the north, where storms and enemies alike pressed hard, survival demanded harmony, even in matters of the bed. And the true strength of a Viking household was shown not in loudness, but in how quietly it endured. The longhouse glowed with the steady fire of the hearth, its smoke curling upward into beams darkened by generations of use. The air was rich with the scent of Viking food, barley stew bubbling thick, dried fish crackling on the coals, and the faint sweetness of mead poured into wooden cups. Around the fire sat kin, their laughter rising with the flicker of flame, while on the edges of the hall shadows moved in silence. The enslaved, whose labour sustained the warmth and plenty without ever being celebrated. A Viking man might boast of his voyages, of silver won across the sea or cattle traded at the Thing, but it was the hands of the enslaved that hauled the water, stacked the firewood, and carried the burdens that made such boasting possible. These men and women were ever present, yet often unseen, their names seldom carved in saga or rune. They lived where the torchlight dimmed, behind the bustle of feasting, their toil woven so tightly into daily life that its absence was rarely imagined. When a Viking child tore a crust of bread from the table, he did not think of the backbent in the fields at harvest, nor the hands that ground the grain through long winter nights. His laughter rang bright above the hall, while a girl of no kinship tidied the scraps, unseen yet essential. This was the quiet sorrow of inequality, not always spoken aloud, but heavy in the silence of those who bore it. A Viking woman, proud keeper of the keys, relied upon these unseen labours as much as her husband relied upon his sword. She directed them with firmness, sometimes with fairness, sometimes with sharpness, but always with the knowledge that her household's strength rested on their unacknowledged endurance. The enslaved tended livestock in frostbitten fields, patched sails stiff with salt, and mended cloaks torn by axe or weather. Their labour was constant, their voices subdued. Yet even within this order, humanity lingered. In the dimmest corners, songs were hummed softly, old tunes from faraway homelands, words carried like embers from one hearth to another. The sagas, though rarely naming them, hint at moments where enslaved women comforted crying children, or enslaved men stood shoulder to shoulder with their masters in sudden danger. Bonds formed quietly, fragile as frost, yet real enough to endure. The sorrow lay not only in chains of status, but in the silence that cloaked it. A Viking man feasting might never speak of the hands that poured his ale, yet without them the hall would falter. A Viking child grew tall, fed by food harvested by those who would never sit at the high seat. Such truths were noticed, yet rarely named, for to name them would be to disturb the balance that everyone depended upon. And so the unseen labour of the enslaved became part of the rhythm of Viking life, steady as the tide, constant as the winter wind. Their presence was not carved in stone, nor sung in glory, but felt in every loaf baked, every cloak mended, every fire kept alive through the dark. In their silence lay the weight of sorrow, in their labour the endurance that carried farms and families through the stormy north. The hall was warm with fire and fellowship, the timbers creaking softly as winter pressed against the walls. Horns of mead passed from hand to hand, the scent of Viking food, roasted lamb, oatcakes crisped on the hearth, and turnips sweetened in butter rising like an offering to the gods. Around the long benches, Viking men spoke in low voices, laughter rumbling like distant thunder. Yet beneath the warmth and ease lay a code as strong as shieldwood, the quiet boundaries that shaped their friendships, lines never crossed, yet always honoured. From youth, a Viking child learned that loyalty was as binding as blood. Fosterage sealed it when a boy was sent to another household to be raised, trained, and disciplined as kin. There he learned not only to wield axe and spear, but to share in labour, to defend the fire against storm and stranger, to carry the honour of another family as if it were his own. When he returned to his father's hall, he returned with bonds no blade could sever. A Viking man might stand against his own kin before betraying the friend of his foster years. Friendship among men was not hidden nor ashamed. Warriors embraced upon meeting, after long voyages, they wept at gravesides. They carved runes into stones to honour companions lost in battle. Yet, all this lay within quiet boundaries. Affection was not questioned when it flowed through loyalty, but to suggest softness beyond that weakness, submission was to invite ruin. In the Viking world, the strength of a man was measured not only by his blows in battle, but by his control over how he was seen. So Viking men kept their friendships fierce but steady, weaving them with oaths at the Thing, or by the prow of a ship before it slipped into storm. An oath sworn over steel and fire was no light matter. It bound a man's soul, making him answerable not only to his companion, but to the gods who heard. To betray such a bond was to unravel honour itself, and honour was life. Even at feasts, where mead loosened tongues and laughter grew bold, the lines held firm. Jests that hinted at weakness or mockery of manhood were dangerous. A single word could turn cheer to bloodshed. Thus, respect was woven into every gesture. A Viking man clapped his friend's shoulder in trust, but his grip was steady, never mocking. His words praised loyalty, never questioned it. The sagas remembered such bonds. Men who followed one another into exile, who stood back to back against overwhelming odds, who avenged each other's deaths though it meant their own. These stories were told not only for glory, but as reminders to the living. Loyalty defined a man, but so did restraint. To know where friendship ended and shame began was as vital as knowing how to parry a blow. In this way, quiet boundaries were kept, unspoken, yet unbroken. A Viking child watching his father and uncles around the hearth saw not only strength of arm, but discipline of heart. He learned that loyalty was fire, warming and fierce. but that it must be tended with care lest it burn out of control. And so Viking men lived by it, walking the narrow line between affection and honour, where respect was the truest measure of friendship. The fire crackled low in the heart of the longhouse, its glow softening the shadows that stretched along carved beams darkened by years of smoke. Outside, frost lay heavy upon the fields, sealing the earth in silence. Inside, kin gathered close, their bellies filled with Viking food, smoked fish torn by hand, bread coarse with barley, goat stew seasoned with wild herbs. Laughter mingled with mead, yet beneath the warmth lingered the unspoken weight of custom, the double scales of fidelity that measured men and women by different weights. A Viking man sat tall at the high seat, his honour carried not only in the scars upon his arms but in the household he guarded. His wife, the keeper of keys, sat near, her authority visible in the iron jingling at her belt. Between them stretched the hearth, symbol of their bond. Yet, though both bore the burden of fidelity, the measure was never equal. For a Viking man, dalliance beyond marriage, especially with women of lower standing, might draw whispers, might spark tension, but often passed without ruin. His strength, his oaths, and his ability to protect his kin could steady the balance. But for a Viking woman, the scales were harsher. Fidelity was her armour, and the loss of it could strip not only herself, but her entire family of honour. A single rumour, a sidelong glance, or a tale spun in malice could shake the pillars of her place. For if a child's lineage was doubted, if inheritance could be questioned, the roots of the farm itself trembled, and so her every action was weighed with the eyes of kin, neighbours, and gods upon her. Yet wisdom found small mercies within the iron laws. A Viking woman, wronged by neglect or cruelty, could claim her right to leave, standing before witnesses at bed and doorway, declaring freedom with words that bound as tightly as chains once had. If a Viking man failed to provide food, or struck her in shame, or mocked the customs of manhood, she could loosen the knot of marriage and reclaim her dowry. Such rights gave her ground to stand upon, though always within the walls of custom. A Viking child, half asleep upon the bench, listened as elders spoke in hushed tones. The boy heard of men who took concubines without fear, and women whose virtue was guarded like treasure. He did not yet understand the weight of these words, but the rhythm of them sank deep, shaping the world he would one day inherit. To him, the Viking food that filled his belly was just warmth and comfort. But to the adults, it was proof of alliances kept, of marriages honoured, of lines secured by the fragile balance of fidelity. The sagas whisper of women who wielded cunning, who bent rules without breaking them, who found ways to shield themselves and their kin against dishonour. They speak too of men who overstepped, whose arrogance fractured their households, proving that even the stronger side of the scale could tilt. Fidelity was not simply rule, it was a game of survival, of silence, and of wisdom hidden in the folds of daily life. Thus the double scales endured, one burden for the Viking man, another for the Viking woman, unequal yet bound together, and in the flicker of the hearth, where shadows of past and future danced, families learned to walk between them, sometimes with sorrow, sometimes with mercy, always with the knowledge that honour was as fragile as flame. The longhouse slept beneath the weight of winter, its roof furred with snow, its walls groaning in the night wind. Inside, the fire burned low, its glow red against benches lined with cloaks and sheepskins. The air carried the scent of Viking food, yesterday's broth, thickened with barley, smoked pork hanging from beams, and bread cooling on flat stones. Yet the warmth of the hearth could not soften the chill that came when a marriage ended. For in the Viking world, divorce was not done in shadows or whispers. It was done properly, with words as binding as law, spoken where all could hear. When a Viking man or woman chose to part, the act began not with anger but with ritual. At the bed, where vows had been first sealed in flesh and witness, the spouse stood and spoke, "I part from thee." The words were plain, yet heavy, echoing louder than the crack of axe on shield. They were not muttered in haste. They were a public marker that the union, once bound, was undone. Then came the doorway. At the threshold of the longhouse, where smoke and night air mingled, the same words were spoken again. Witnesses gathered, kin, neighbours, sometimes the very elders who had overseen the match. The declaration was made, where feet had crossed countless times, carrying Viking food to feasts, firewood to the hearth, children into the light. To end a marriage, there was to open the path anew, to step across as separate souls. A Viking woman had rights in this matter, rare among the lands of Europe. If her husband struck her, neglected her, or failed in the duties of provision, she could speak the words and claim her dowry. Keys rattled at her belt as she stepped forth, proof that her role had not been erased. A Viking man too could divorce, often when his wife's honour faltered or when alliances shifted. But both were bound to do it properly, in the open, with the gods and community as witness. A Viking child might stand silent by the hearth, wide-eyed as his parents' voices carried through the hall. To him, the words were strange, unsettling, yet the calm of the ritual lessened the sting. There were no secret quarrels tearing at the walls, no hidden shame. Only the measured cadence of custom, ensuring that even an ending did not shatter the household's dignity. The sagas tell of women who walked from beds and doorways with heads unbowed, and of men who declared their parting before dawn and sailed by noon. Divorce did not brand them failures. It was survival, a reshaping of bonds to keep the wider fabric whole. Better an honourable parting than a household rotted by strife, for strife could poison kinship and spark feuds that echoed for generations. Thus, divorce, when done properly, was no scandal but a safeguard. It allowed Viking men and women to step away with their names intact, their property divided, their children acknowledged. In the glow of the hearth and the hush of witnesses, balance was restored, and the longhouse endured another winter, steady as the fjord cliffs against the sea. The wind wailed outside the timbered walls, its icy breath pushing through every crack of the longhouse. Within, the hearth glowed, sending ribbons of smoke up into the rafters darkened by years of fire. Around it, kin drew close, wrapped in woolen cloaks, sharing Viking food, smoked fish, oatcakes, and stew thick with cabbage and lamb fat. Yet beyond fire and fare, another kind of warmth was sought. In the Viking world, amulets were the hidden guard, small tokens stitched into cloth or worn upon the chest, believed to shield the body and soul from the bite of fate. A Viking man wore Thor's hammer, a tiny silver likeness hanging from his neck, its weight no greater than a coin, yet carrying the force of thunder. To him it was not trinket but shield, a promise that storms, sickness, and sudden violence might falter before divine strength. Beside him, a Viking child slept with beads woven into his tunic, the faint clink of glass and amber like whispers of the sea. His mother had sewn them there in quiet hope that restless dreams would pass him by, that spirits prowling the dark would see the charm and turn away. A Viking woman carried her own token's keys at her belt, yes, but also beads of bone and bronze, or a small charm carved from wood, rubbed smooth by her thumb during prayers. Some women buried charms beneath thresholds, believing they guarded against ill fortune stepping inside. Others tied them into the bedding of newborns, seeking to keep the little ones safe from the cold that crept as silently as hunger. In these rituals lay tenderness, as practical as stacking firewood, as sacred as offering to the gods. When the long winters deepened, families leaned harder on such protections. A pouch of herbs tied at the neck, a hammer pressed into the palm of a child before sleep, a bead dropped into the stew pot for luck before it was ladled into wooden bowls. These acts were not folly, they were anchors. In a world where disease might take a household in a season, where frost could kill calves before spring, Faith in charms gave courage to endure. The sagas rarely dwell on such small things, yet the earth remembers. Archaeologists dig up beads scattered in soil, amulets clutched in graves, hammer pendants rusted but still shaped with care. They tell us that a Viking man might face battle with sword in hand and still trust a charm at his throat, that a Viking woman might manage a household of 10 and still whisper over a bead before tucking it into her child's clothes. By the firelight, these tokens gleamed like captured stars, fragile yet enduring. They were not only shields against harm, but reminders that life was more than toil and fear. They gave sleep to the weary, courage to the living, and hope to the mothers who watched their children breathe softly through the long northern night. In the land of frost and fjord, amulets were quiet promises against the cold, against the dark, against despair itself. Frost veiled the fields, each stalk of barley rimmed with silver as dawn crept over the ridges. In the longhouse, the hearth was already alive, crackling beneath iron pots that smelled of Viking food, stew of lamb and onions, bread baked dark with rye, and the sharp tang of ale brewing in clay jars. As smoke curled upward into the rafters, the people stirred, murmuring thanks not only for the warmth, but for the unseen hands of the gods in the grain. For every sheaf cut, every loaf baked, every sip swallowed, carried the weight of the divine. A Viking man took his scythe to the fields with reverence. Each sweep was not merely labour, but an offering, for he believed the grain bent low beneath the breath of gods. When the harvest was plentiful, it was said that the great hammer-wielder had smiled upon the land, shaking storms aside to let the sun ripen seed. When frost struck too early, it was whispered that another god, mischievous and cruel, had twisted the season's fate. A Viking child, running between the rows of cut barley, listened wide-eyed to such stories, learning early that the field was never just soil. It was a place where the human hand and the divine hand worked side by side. Women of the household, keepers of the keys, wove their own blessings into the grain. Before grinding, a Viking woman might press a bead or charm into the millstone, believing it kept the flour from spoiling. She might hum an old verse while kneading dough, words passed down from her grandmother's lips, half prayer, half lullaby. To her, the rising loaf was not only Viking food, it was proof of life enduring against the cold, proof that the gods had not turned their faces away. In autumn feasts, stories of deities wove themselves through the drinking horns. A skald would speak of Freya, who made the fields swell with golden promise, or of a goddess who guarded the hearth, her favour seen in full bins and fat cattle. These tales were not told as fancy, but as truth stitched into the fabric of life. A Viking man drinking by the fire believed as surely in the gods in the grain as he did in the sword at his belt. And when famine threatened, when rains drowned the seed, or drought cracked the soil, families turned to ritual. A handful of grain cast into the sea, a loaf buried beneath the threshold, a quiet prayer whispered over the fields at dawn, all gestures to remind the gods that their people still remembered, still honoured, still asked for mercy. The sagas speak of warriors and voyages, but in the silent furrows of the field lay the truest battles, to coax life from a land that could kill as swiftly as it could nourish. For the Viking people, survival itself was sacred. Each bite of bread carried the weight of myth, each sip of ale the memory of gods. The grain was not only food, it was covenant, woven of sweat, soil, and the divine breath that lingered over the north. The sea mist clung to the timbers of the longhouse, curling through the air like pale smoke from a hidden fire. Inside, the hearth roared, casting light over bowls of Viking food, steaming fish drawn from the fjord, bread black with rye, and slabs of pork glistening with fat. The warmth of kinship filled the hall, but outside, footsteps crunched over frost. Strangers had come to the threshold, their cloaks stitched in foreign patterns, their tongues carrying sounds that rolled strangely against the ear. Outsiders at the door, watchers of Viking life, their eyes filled with both wonder and unease. A Viking man rose from his bench, broad-shouldered and steady, and went to greet them. He knew the weight of such encounters, for word of the north had already spread across distant rivers and seas. To the travellers, the sight of the longhouse itself was something of myth, a timbered hall, alive with smoke and laughter, hung with shields, smelling of roasted meat and wet wool. They entered cautiously, their faces flickering in the firelight, as if uncertain whether they had stepped into a home or a legend. The outsider's gaze lingered on the Viking women who moved with keys at their belts, pouring ale with a sure hand, speaking in voices clear and unashamed. In lands where women were hidden, such presence seemed shocking, even unsettling. A Viking child, seated near the hearth, watched them curiously while tearing at a crust of bread. To him, there was nothing strange in his mother, commanding the household, or in his sister, weaving charms into cloth. But he could see, by the stranger's eyes, that what was ordinary here was mystery beyond their seas. Stories had long travelled with these foreigners, that Viking men bathed more than others, that their hair was brushed smooth, that their halls echoed with song even in winter's bite. Some outsiders admired this vigour, whispering that such habits made the Northmen strong and proud. Others muttered of looseness, of households where concubines served, and divorce was spoken aloud at hearth and door. They called it wild, yet secretly wondered if it was freedom. The travellers were offered bowls of stew, chunks of cheese, and horns of mead. They ate, yet their glances betrayed a restless awe, as though every gesture hid a secret. To them, the poetry sung by the skald was not only entertainment, but a riddle. How could words carry honour, or insult draw blood? They marvelled at the runes carved into wood and stone, marks that to Viking children were as natural as breath, but to foreign eyes looked like whispers of another world. When they left, the mist swallowed them again, and their voices drifted across the shore like gulls crying against the wind. Some would return home praising the strength of Viking men and women, telling of halls where honour was fire and kinship iron. Others would twist their tales, speaking of savagery and strange freedoms. Yet in truth, they had seen but the surface, for the heart of the North was not in the stories they carried away, but in the quiet pulse of the hearth, where life unfolded in ways outsiders could never truly hold. The wind sighed over the fjord, carrying with it the salt of the sea and the sharp bite of pine smoke. In the longhouse, the fire blazed steady, casting its glow across benches laden with Viking food. Smoked herring, flatbread dark with barley, and bowls of stew thickened by root vegetables, pulled from the earth before frost claimed them. The rhythm of life in these lands was measured not by clocks or bells, but by the seasons themselves, whose hand lay heavy on the body, the spirit, and the fate of every Viking man, woman, and child. In summer, the days stretched long, the sun refusing to set until the world was drenched in endless light. A Viking man worked tirelessly in those bright hours, swinging scythe and axe, knowing that every cut of hay and every grain gathered meant survival in the dark months ahead. The sweat on his brow was more than labour, it was promise, an oath to his kin that they would endure when the snows came. Beside him, a Viking child might scatter seeds into furrows or carry water in small wooden pails, his laughter rising into the summer air. Even the smallest hands had their part to play, for the season's generosity was fleeting. A Viking woman, keeper of stores and hearth, matched the rhythm of the land with her own. She dried fish upon racks, salted meat, churned butter, and laid herbs in bundles to hang from the beams. Her work was steady and patient, guided by wisdom passed through generations. She knew which foods lasted longest, which spices soothed the sick, and which grains, if carefully guarded, might stretch a starving household through the leanest weeks. Her labours were less thunderous than the man's scythe, but no less mighty, for it was her care that kept the longhouse standing when the winds howled fiercest. Winter brought silence. The fields lay under ice, the rivers stilled, and the nights seemed endless, broken only by the glow of fire on timber beams. Families gathered close, wrapped in furs, sharing bowls of porridge and drinking from horns of ale brewed in summer. Viking children listened wide-eyed to tales told by the skald, their bellies full yet yearning for more. The body slowed in winter, its hunger constant, its rest deep. It was a season of patience, of conserving strength, of leaning on kinship as much as food. The sagas remember the feasts of plenty, but beneath them lay the unspoken truth. Survival depended on the quiet rhythm of harvest and hunger, on pacing the stores, on resisting the temptation to feast too quickly when snow lay thick. A Viking man knew that the body, like the land, could not burn endlessly. It had to rest, to wait, to endure. Thus the seasons ruled not only field and fjord, but the very bones of the people. Short summers demanded labour beyond measure. Long winters demanded stillness and resolve. Between them stretched the fragile balance of Viking life, where every loaf baked, every fish smoked, every tale told by the hearth was part of a greater rhythm. The patient pacing of survival in a land both generous and merciless. Smoke curled upward in the longhouse, carrying with it the scent of charred wood and Viking food, simmering over the coals, barley porridge, salted fish, and broth enriched with bones cracked open for their marrow. The hearth glowed like the heart of the household, and around it gathered men and women, children and elders, their faces painted gold by firelight. In the hush, between the crackle of flames and the rustle of cloaks, a skald rose. His voice, clear and measured, carried the weight of old words, the songs of the sagas. A Viking man leaned forward, hands roughened by the oar and the axe, eager for the tale. Beside him, a Viking child clutched a wooden cup, wide-eyed, already half dreaming of heroes and battles. Yet the sagas were not only of steel and blood, they carried whispers of the heart, threads of longing woven carefully between verses. Desire appeared not as thunder, but as a ripple on still water, soft, glimmering, easily missed by those who did not listen with care. The skalds sang of women whose glances lingered longer than custom allowed, of men who carved verses into wood when their tongues dared not speak. But such moments were veiled, wrapped in riddles and metaphors, for the sagas chose their silences as carefully as their words. A Viking woman might be praised for her wisdom, her fairness, her beauty, but rarely did the tale dwell on the warmth of her hand in another's, or the softness of her whispered laughter by the hearth. Such details remained hidden, as private as the fur bedding beneath which lovers lay. Desire was dangerous, the skald knew it. A misplaced verse, too bold, could cut deeper than any sword. A Viking man who sang of another's wife risked not admiration, but exile, perhaps death. So the sagas showed longing only in fragments, half a stanza, a passing glance, a faint smile caught in the telling. To speak more openly was to tempt ruin. Thus the storm of passion was muted, its presence only a ripple, seen in the shimmer of words but never named outright. The Viking child, drowsy with warmth and Viking food, heard these tales with innocence, not yet aware of the currents beneath the surface. To him, they were stories of valour and fate. Yet the adults knew better. They heard the pause in the skald's song, the weight of a name spoken with reverence, the hesitation before a stanza that hinted at forbidden love. They felt the silence more than the words themselves, for in silence lived truth too dangerous to speak aloud. So the sagas endured, tales of gods, of kings, of wandering men and steadfast women. Desire walked within them, quiet and careful, never the storm that broke ships apart, but the ripple that bent the course of rivers. And in the longhouse, as the skald's voice faded and the fire sank low, the listeners understood. What the old stories chose to show kept order alive, what they chose to silence kept the hearth unbroken. In that balance lay the strength of the Viking people, the art of saying enough, but never too much. The fire burned low, throwing long shadows against the smoke-darkened beams of the hall. Outside, Frost hardened the earth, and the fjord lay still beneath the winter moon. Inside, families gathered close, the warmth of Viking food, barley bread, roasted lamb, and bowls of steaming broth binding them together against the cold. In such moments, when the hush of night fell heavy, talk turned to names, for in the Viking world, a name was more than a sound. It was weight, memory, and destiny. A Viking man cradled his newborn son, swaddled in wool and fur, the child's breath, a faint mist in the firelight. Around him, kin waited, their silence deep as the sea. The naming was not hurried. It came with care, for to name a child was to set a path before his feet. Often, the name of an ancestor was spoken, and with it, the strength of that life was believed to flow into the child. A Viking child might carry the name of a grandfather who had died with axe in hand, or a grandmother whose wisdom had kept a household through famine. Thus, the dead walked again in the steps of the living. The women of the hall understood this deeply. A Viking woman, her hands still red from kneading bread and tending fire, watched with quiet pride as her daughter was named. The girl might be called after an aunt remembered for her cleverness, or after a long-lost relative who had kept faith through hardship. Each name was a thread, binding present to past, weaving the living into a tapestry of kin stretching back through generations. Names carried honour, but also peril. A Viking man, whose child bore the name of a famed warrior, was expected to raise him in that spirit. To falter was to dishonour not only the child, but the ancestor whose memory he carried. Likewise, a name tied to a family feud could rouse old fires, reminding neighbours of blood unsettled. A name was a banner, visible to all, announcing lineage, loyalty, and expectation. Even in daily life, names held weight. A Viking child called by his full name at the hearth felt the seriousness of it, the reminder that he bore more than himself. At feasts, when names were recited aloud in toasts, the hall seemed to echo with the presence of those long dead, as though their spirits leaned closer to the fire, listening. To forget a name was unthinkable. To twist one in insult could provoke feud or bloodshed. The sagas themselves guarded names like treasure. They spoke of who begot whom, who carried which title, who claimed which land. In the lineage of names, the people preserved their memory, their deeds, and their place in the world. A Viking man without sons feared the loss of his name more than the loss of wealth, for silver might be stolen, but a broken line was gone forever. So the naming of a child was no small act. It was covenant, it was promise. And as the fire sank lower and the voices of the hall softened into song, the weight of those names hung in the air like the stars outside, shining, enduring, guiding every step the living took upon the earth. The fire snapped and hissed, sparks leaping upward like fleeting spirits before vanishing into the smoke-dark rafters. Winter pressed close beyond the timber walls, yet inside the longhouse warmth held steady, fed by logs split and stacked by younger hands. Around the hearth sat the generation's Viking child, Viking woman, Viking man, each carrying the rhythm of their age, each shaped by the same unrelenting seasons. In youth, a Viking man strode with the fire of the sun in midsummer. His body was strong, his steps quick, his heart restless with bravado. Songs praised his deeds at sea, his victories in the field, his laughter as loud as thunder rolling over the fjord. Beside him, Viking women watched with guarded eyes, for such vigour was as dangerous as it was admired. Desire in youth often burned too brightly, and in its blaze households could tremble. Yet it was also the fire from which marriages were forged, fields ploughed, and children born. With time, the body changed. Strength still clung to the Viking man, but it no longer leapt so easily. Muscles stiffened with the bite of frost and the memory of too many winters rowing longships. His role shifted, less toward conquest and more toward guardianship. He became the steady hand, the quiet voice that calmed disputes before they turned to feud. At feasts, where once he drank deep and boasted loud, he now raised his horn with measured dignity, offering words of counsel rather than challenge. The Viking woman, too, transformed with the years. No longer judged only for her fertility, she grew into the heart of the household. Keys hung heavier at her belt, not as tokens of duty, but as symbols of authority. She taught the younger women, which Viking foods lasted longest in winter, how to stretch barley through famine, how to spin wool so tightly it could outlast the storms. Her wisdom was sought as much as her labour, her words shaping households as surely as her hands once rocked cradles. For both man and woman, desire softened with age but did not vanish. It became memory, woven into stories whispered by the firelight, gentle reminders of passions once fierce, now tempered into companionship. A Viking child, listening half asleep, might not grasp the depth of such tales, yet he felt their warmth in the laughter between his elders, in the way his grandfather's hand rested gently over his grandmother's as she poured mead. Aging in the Viking world was not decline alone, it was a turning of roles. The young bore the weight of action, the old carried the weight of meaning. Elders became keepers of honour, their sexuality no longer measured by vigour but by dignity. They spoke with authority about the balance between men and women, about fidelity and folly, about the cost of reckless desire. Their guidance was treasure, as essential as Viking food in the storehouse or timber in the walls. So, by the hearth, as snow beat against the roof and the northern wind howled through the gaps, the old sat steady living memory of all that had come before. They had burned with passion, they had borne children, they had endured hunger and feud. Now they gave back in counsel, in story, in song proof that in the Viking age, even as the body grew frail, the spirit's place at the hearth never dimmed. The fire glowed deep in the belly of the longhouse, embers pulsing like the heart of the night. Around it, voices rose in low laughter, the sound of kin and neighbours passing the dark hours together. Viking food, smoked fish, barley cakes, and horns of ale was shared from hand to hand, and with each bite and sip, the tongues grew looser. Yet, even in merriment, every Viking man and Viking woman knew that words were like blades. They could warm a feast with humour, or they could cut deeper than steel. It often began with a jest, light as drifting snow. A Viking child might stumble carrying a wooden bowl, and his uncle, grinning, would call him Lord of Spilled Porridge. The hall would chuckle, the child red with embarrassment, but the laughter was gentle, teaching him to carry both bowl and name with more care next time. In such ways, humour shaped the young, pressing lessons into memory without the sting of punishment. Among Viking men, teasing was a dance of balance. To jest about one's poor hunting luck or clumsy sword stroke was fair. Such words prodded pride but left no lasting wound. Laughter kept egos from swelling too large and reminded each man that honour was proven in action, not in boast alone, yet all knew the hidden line. To accuse another of cowardice, or worse, of failing in matters of bed and kin, was to step into shadow. Such words, once spoken, could not be pulled back. They demanded answer, sometimes in feud, sometimes in blood. Viking women too wielded laughter with skill. Around the spinning wheel, or in the warmth of shared chores, they teased one another about a husband's loud snores or a child's stubbornness. These small jests eased burdens and bound them in sisterhood, but they too knew restraint. A joke about a woman's fidelity or a child's lineage could unravel trust, spreading like smoke through the village until it poisoned even the strongest household. The sagas remember times when a verse, lightly meant, turned deadly. A scold might weave a clever rhyme about another's clumsy stride or crooked smile, and the hall would roar with delight. Yet, if the rhyme hinted at dishonour, if it touched on the hidden matters of intimacy, then laughter turned sharp. A Viking man, proud of his lineage and his strength, could not endure such insult in silence. What began as jest could end in duel beneath the open sky. So the people learned to wield laughter as carefully as the sword. Humour kept peace in long winters, smoothed quarrels before they grew, and gave voice to truths too small for the law to judge. But restraint was the shield that kept it from breaking bonds. The Viking child, who watched the elders laugh at themselves, also learned where silence must fall. Thus the village lived by a rhythm of jest and judgment, knowing that in a world where reputation was as fragile as ice on a thawing river, the sharpest edge was not the axe, but the tongue. And in the glow of the hearth, beneath beams darkened by centuries of smoke, the people practiced that balanced laughter as warmth, restraint as wisdom, so that the hall might endure unbroken through storm and season alike. Snow fell soft across the rooftops, settling like down on the thatch, while inside the longhouse the hearth glowed steady. Viking food simmered in iron pots, fish broth rich with herbs, bread baking on flat stones, the smell of smoke and grain heavy in the rafters. Yet the true work of the hall was not only in the fire or the axe. It was in the quiet, patient labour of mothers, whose hands shaped the rhythm of every Viking household. By firelight, a Viking woman bent over her loom. The shuttle clicked back and forth, threads stretching like the strands of fate themselves. Wool spun from sheep raised on the green slopes became cloaks, sails, and bedding. Each garment bore not only warmth, but the dignity of survival. A Viking man might wield his sword upon distant shores, but it was the textile, woven strong, that kept him alive in the wind and the rain. Nearby, a Viking child watched, eyes wide, as his mother's fingers danced across the warp. She spoke softly, telling him the stories of gods and kin, weaving memory as tightly as she wove the wool. For mothers were not only keepers of cloth, but keepers of knowledge. They taught daughters how to card wool and stir the stew pots, taught sons to respect the value of food and the strength of the hearth. In their words, children learned what it meant to belong to a family, to a farmstead, to a people bound by honour. The Viking woman also carried the burden of stores. She counted barrels of salted herring, jars of honey, stacks of dried meat, and the precious sacks of barley and rye that meant the difference between feast and famine. A key ring, heavy at her belt, clinked as she moved between chests and storerooms. To misjudge the tally was to risk hunger in the deep months of frost. To measure wisely was to ensure that when the sea froze and the earth slept, every Viking child could still eat, and every Viking man could still stand strong enough to defend the farm. Amid these labours, tenderness lingered. A lullaby hummed low as mothers rocked infants in carved cradles, the song rising and falling like the tide against the fjord. Small hands clutched at woolen skirts, while lessons were spoken patiently, which herbs soothed a cough, which charms to tie above the bed for safe sleep, which gods to honour when storms rattled the beams. These teachings passed from lips to ears, binding one generation to the next with threads stronger than flax. It was quiet work, often unseen by the sagas that sang of warriors and kings. Yet without it, no longhouse could endure. The strength of Viking mothers was not only in their hands, but in their steadiness, the way they stitched together winters, meals, and memories into a fabric as enduring as the sails that carried their kin across the seas. In their weaving, in their tallying, in their teaching, they held the household together like the hidden knots in the loom, firm, silent, and unbroken, even when the winds howled fiercest outside. The wind off the fjord carried more than salt and snow, it carried whispers of change. Within the timbered longhouse, the hearth burned as it always had, Viking food simmering in pots, fish stews thickened with barley, bread baked on flat stones, mead passed between kin. Yet amid the warmth and smoke, new words began to thread their way into old songs. A Viking man, grey at the temples, listened as a travelling monk spoke of a single god, of vows unbroken, of marriages that no hand but heaven could dissolve. Around him, Viking women and Viking children watched, their brows furrowed, as if measuring the weight of these foreign words against the weight of their own ancestors. For generations, a Viking woman might rise from her marriage bed, speak the words of separation at the door, and claim her dowry back with dignity. Divorce was not shame, but a practical measure, keeping households from breaking under the strain of violence, neglect, or dishonor. Yet the new faith frowned upon such endings. It preached endurance, even in suffering, and exalted a union sanctified by the church rather than the hearth. The Viking man who had once seen marriage as an alliance of kin now faced a stricter bond, bound by vows to a god who was foreign to his fathers. Still, the change was slow. A Viking child, growing under the new dawn, might learn both sets of ways. The sagas that spoke of gods who feasted, fought, and loved as men and women did, and the sermons of monks who told of saints and martyrs who turned away from desire. In the evenings, the hall resounded with both songs of Thor's hammer sung beside prayers whispered in Latin. The people lived in a crosswind, caught between storm and stillness, uncertain which current would carry them. The feasts revealed the shift most clearly. Where once marriages were sealed with keys and swords exchanged, the priest now raised a cross above the couple. The old tokens did not vanish. Viking women still held the keys. Viking men still offered gifts of weapons, but another layer of meaning was placed upon them. The union was no longer only between families. It was now bound to a church that stood in stone beyond the village. Yet the sagas tell us the old ways did not bow easily. A Viking woman still demanded respect. She still measured food in the storerooms and kept tally of the flocks. A Viking man still defended his kin with axe and shield. Children still listened to the tales of Odin and Freya by the fire, even as they were taught the words of Christ by day. The two faiths lived side by side, sometimes clashing, sometimes blending, as though the fjord itself had learned to carry two tides at once. So the crosswinds of faith reshaped the north, not with sudden violence, but with patient persistence. The old gods lingered in song, in stone carvings, in whispered charms tied above a child's cradle. The new god settled in vows, in fewer divorces, in prayers that outlasted the winter storms. Between them, the Viking world walked a narrow path, one foot in frost and saga, the other in scripture and church bell, bound forever by both memory and change. The hearth crackled, its glow painting the longhouse beams in amber light. Outside, snow lay deep across the fields, muffling the world in silence. But inside the hall, the rhythms of life continued as they always had. Viking food steamed in clay bowls stewed lamb, turnips, and bread dense with barley. A Viking child, his cheeks flushed from the cold, gnawed on a crust, while his mother measured out stores with the ring of keys at her belt. Yet beneath these familiar tasks, subtle changes stirred, like a river shifting its course beneath the ice. What stayed? What shifted? These were the questions carried in quiet moments, when old ways met new winds. A Viking man remembered his father's words. Marriage was a bond between kin, settled with sword and dowry, broken if dishonor darkened the hearth. But now, whispers of the cross and vows before stone churches pressed into the village. Some grumbled, some yielded. Divorce, once spoken at the threshold, became rarer, but not forgotten. Families still gathered to settle disputes over land, inheritance, and shame, even as priests urged patience and endurance. The Viking man walked both roads axe in hand for his ancestors, prayer on his lips for the new god. In the kitchens, compromise was softer. Viking women still brewed ale in barrels, their skill vital for feasts and trade. Yet now, some poured a measure for offerings at Christian altars, as well as to the old gods of hearth and harvest. Children grew up seeing both. Charms carved with hammers hung beside crosses carved in wood. They learned that survival lay not in stubbornness, but in weaving two patterns into one cloth. On the fields, the changes were quieter still. A Viking child learned to sow and reap as his ancestors had, guided by the rhythm of seasons. Yet when the priest blessed the soil in spring, the family bowed their heads. The old songs to Freya were not abandoned. They were sung in whispers, after dark, in voices careful as falling snow. What shifted was not faith itself, but how it was spoken. The gods were still there, only joined by another presence, one that demanded space but did not erase. In the evenings, laughter and story bridged the divide. Around the fire, skalds told sagas of heroes who defended honor, of gods who quarreled and feasted, while the monk read from a book that spoke of saints who endured hunger and storms for a higher truth. A Viking man listened, weighing both tales, knowing his children would grow in a world where neither could be cast aside. So the people learned compromise, not with loud defiance, nor with surrender, but with quiet weaving. A prayer said at church, a charm hung above the cradle. A feast begun with the sign of the cross, ended with a toast to ancestors. Viking food, Viking labour, Viking stories they endured, though touched by new customs. What stayed was the heart of the people, their honour, their kinship, their need to endure the long winters together. What shifted was the wrapping, the shape of the words and rituals. And in that balance, the North kept its soul, unbroken, even as tides of change lapped at its shores. The fjord lay still beneath the pale glow of the moon, its waters unbroken save for the slow breath of tide against stone. A hush had fallen, as though even the sea had grown weary of speaking. Within the longhouse, the fire smouldered low, its last embers pulsing like the heart of the hall. The night the fjord fell silent was no omen, but a moment when all of Viking life seemed to draw into itself duty, blessing, labour, and love, folded softly under woolen cloaks. On the sleeping benches, Viking men rested side by side with their kin, their axes leaned against the walls, their shields stacked close at hand. The day's strength had been spent on the fields and the sea, and now they lay with quiet breath, their honour secure in the order of kinship. Beside them, Viking women drew children closer, wrapping them in furs thick with the scent of lanolin and smoke. A Viking child stirred in sleep, murmuring a half-formed dream of longships and sagas, then nestled deeper into his mother's warmth. The air was thick with the residue of Viking food broth still clinging to pots by the hearth, the tang of smoked fish lingering on the beams. These smells, mingled with the musk of wool and pine resin, told the story of survival. They were not merely scents, but reminders of labour and care. Women who had stirred the stews through the day, men who had hunted and hauled the catch, children who had gathered twigs for the fire. Each had played a part in keeping the night warm. Here, in the dimming glow, intimacy was not the roaring passion sung in tales of gods, but the quiet closeness of bodies breathing together. A Viking man's hand rested on his wife's shoulder, not in hunger, but in reassurance. A Viking woman hummed low, a tune that carried no words yet bound the household in its steady rhythm. In these moments, the body was both duty and blessing, a vessel of survival, a source of kin, and a balm against the cold that pressed hard upon the timbered walls. Above them, smoke curled lazily through the rafters, slipping out into the night where stars wheeled like ancient watchers. The gods were remembered in silence, their names carried in thought more than in speech. For though laws and faith had shifted, though new priests whispered of one god instead of many, the essence of Viking life remained steady, the bond of kin, the endurance of winter, the order found in shared breath and shared burden. Outside, frost crept over the earth, and the fjord sighed with the rhythm of eternity. Inside, the longhouse was a cradle of warmth and memory. The embers dimmed to a red glow, then to ash, yet the hearts of those within burned steady, their lives interwoven like the warp and weft of wool. The night the fjord fell silent was not a night of fear, but of rest. A lullaby written in firelight and sea breath, closing not a single tale, but carrying forward all the threads of a people who knew that to live as a Viking was to live bound together by duty, by care, and by love, even in silence.